Welcome to Mr. Sandman's, where the world fades and your worries drift into whispers. Tonight, as you settle into the quiet, let each breath take you deeper into darkness, where stories stir in the shadows and await only you. Here you'll leave behind the day's burdens and enter a realm of suspense, fear, and fascination, all while slipping peacefully into slumber. So close your eyes, relax, and let Mr. Sandman guide you into a night of haunting dreams and gentle chills. Sweet nightmares. The House That Listens. The rain hadn't stopped since Emma drove into town. It was the kind of rain that seemed to cling to the landscape, making everything soggy, gray, and muffled. The town was small and unremarkable, a crumbling gas station, a diner that looked like it hadn't seen a fresh coat of paint in decades, and a single inn with flickering neon lights that read rooms. Emma had always been drawn to places like this. She was a graduate student in psychology, writing her thesis on the power of urban legends. She had made a career, or at least the beginnings of one, out of exploring haunted sites and places drenched in folklore. And this town held one of the most enticing mysteries she'd come across in her research. A sprawling Victorian mansion, perched on the outskirts like a sentinel over the town. The locals called it the House That Listens. For over a century, every resident of that mansion had disappeared without a trace. No bodies, no explanations, just vanished. Some said the house was cursed. Others whispered that it was alive, that it took people who dared to ignore its warnings. The whispers were what Emma found most intriguing, though the townsfolk never said more than a few sentences about it, always in hushed tones and anxious glances. As she checked into the inn, the elderly innkeeper eyed her with a mixture of pity and fear. "You're here about that house, aren't you?" he asked, his voice cracked and soft, as though each word might break him further. Emma smiled, trying to lighten the mood. "Just a little research. I'm writing my thesis." The old man's gaze hardened, his knobby fingers gripping the edge of the counter. "Listen, young lady, that house, it knows when you're talking about it. It knows when someone's coming. It listens." His voice dropped to a whisper, as if he feared the house might hear him even here. "The last one who went up there, well, we never saw him again. And the night he disappeared, we all heard something like wailing echoing through the town, so loud it rattled the windows." Emma brushed off his words, but that night she struggled to sleep. The rain tapped incessantly against her window, and strange sounds seemed to emanate from the hallway. Soft footsteps, an occasional creak, and once she thought she heard a child's faint laughter just outside her door. The next morning, armed with her notebook, recorder, and flashlight, Emma made her way to the mansion. It loomed before her, shadowed and somber, with ivy crawling up its sides like dark veins. The air around the house felt thick, as if it resisted her presence. She pushed open the heavy oak doors, which groaned in protest, and stepped inside. The house was eerily silent, save for the occasional drip of water echoing from somewhere within. The wallpaper was peeling, faded to a sickly yellow with patterns that seemed to swirl if she looked at them too long. A grand staircase spiraled upwards, each step dustier than the last. And then she heard it, soft, almost indistinct, a whisper, like someone speaking just beyond the walls. "Come closer." She shivered but brushed it off, clicking on her recorder. Entering the foyer, initial atmosphere is oppressive. The air feels thick, stale, like it hasn't moved in decades. Her voice felt small in the cavernous space swallowed up by the shadows. As she explored, she found personal items scattered in odd places, a pair of eyeglasses perched on a broken banister, a child's toy half buried in dust near a fireplace, a woman's locket lying open on a windowsill, the photo inside so faded it was almost invisible. Each object felt out of place, as though they had been left by people in a hurry, or snatched away from their owners in the middle of a quiet moment. The whispers grew louder as she moved through the house, shifting between barely audible and almost coherent. She strained to make out the words, pressing her recorder closer to capture them, her heartbeat quickening. "Help me. Please." Emma stumbled upon a parlor room filled with old furniture, each piece draped in tattered sheets, like ghosts frozen in place. And on a dusty end table, she found a note scrawled hastily, words trembling with panic. "It's watching. Don't look at the mirrors. They show you what it wants you to see." She swallowed hard and moved on, trying to ignore the mirrors that lined the walls, each one reflecting warped images of the room, the angles distorted and wrong. She could have sworn she saw movement in the corner of her eye, figures flitting through the reflections, too quick to capture when she looked directly. In one room, she discovered a trunk filled with journals. She opened one, the handwriting shaky and uneven, describing how the previous resident felt the house watching him, how he could hear voices in the walls, and how the room seemed to shift when he wasn't looking. "I thought I could escape," he wrote, "but every path leads me back to where I started. The house won't let me go." Emma's hands trembled as she closed the journal. She was beginning to feel the same, disoriented, like the hallways were stretching and contracting around her. The air was growing colder, her breath visible in thin, white puffs. She stumbled into a hidden room, tucked behind a door she hadn't noticed before. It was a small, dark chamber filled with items, rings, pocket watches, photographs, toys, and clothing. Each piece looked as if it had been plucked from a different decade, carefully arranged in a morbid collection. Emma felt a wave of nausea as she realized they were trophies, remnants of the house's residents. The whispers grew louder, overlapping, filling the room with a cacophony of pleas and sobs. Her recorder caught phrases she could barely decipher. "It took me. It's hungry. The walls. Don't leave me here." The panic clawed at her chest. She turned, running through the hallways, but each path seemed to twist and turn in on itself, leading her back to rooms she had already passed. Her own voice trembled as she spoke into the recorder. "I'm lost. I can't find the exit. The house is changing, trapping me." The whispers followed her, louder now, almost gleeful. "Stay with us. Forever." Finally, she spotted the front door. She sprinted toward it, but as she reached for the handle, the door slammed shut, as though an invisible force was pushing against her. She felt hands, cold, ghostly hands, grasping at her, pulling her back. She screamed, throwing herself against the door, clawing at it, feeling splinters embed in her skin. With one last desperate shove, she forced the door open and staggered outside, collapsing on the porch, gasping for air. The house loomed behind her, dark and silent, as if it had let her go. For now. As she stumbled back to the town, she noticed something strange. The people she passed looked at her as though they'd never seen her before. When she returned to the inn, the innkeeper squinted at her, confused. "Do I know you?" Emma stammered, trying to explain, but he shook his head, muttering to himself and shuffling away as if she were a stranger. Back in her room, shaken but relieved, she played back the recordings. But there was nothing, just static. And then faintly, her own voice whispering, "Please let me out." And just beneath her voice, she heard the faintest whisper, a deep, chilling murmur. "Welcome home." Book 2. Whispers in the Woods. The headlights of Tyler's truck cut through the dark forest road as he and his 3 best friends hurtled toward their camping destination. It was their annual ritual, one weekend, deep in the Utah wilderness, far from cell signals and the noise of everyday life. This year, they'd chosen a spot so remote that the road itself was barely a thread winding through the dense trees. "I can't even see the sky out here," Connor muttered from the back seat, peering out the window at the trees looming closer and closer. That's the whole point, man, Jake chuckled. We're here to rough it, remember? But as they drove deeper, the laughter faded. A mist had begun to creep through the trees, thickening until it became a gray haze. The forest swallowed their headlights, making the world feel smaller, more isolated. They didn't speak much after that. Finally, they arrived, setting up camp in a small clearing surrounded by towering trees. As dusk settled in, they built a fire, and as usual, tried to outdo each other with ghost stories. But that night, the tales felt different. The forest absorbed their voices, as if it were listening. Shadows leapt and danced beyond the firelight, casting strange shapes that seemed to shift with each flicker of the flames. All right, last story, Mason said, leaning closer to the fire, his voice a hushed whisper. You guys ever heard of skinwalkers? Tyler snorted. I thought we were done with ghost stories. No, I'm serious, Mason insisted, his voice low and serious. They're shapeshifters, creatures that mimic voices, appearances, even memories. They'll look just like your best friend, right down to the clothes they're wearing. But it's not them, not really. The group chuckled uneasily, though none of them could shake the chill that crept up their spines. Hours later, long after the fire had died down, Connor left the tent to use the bathroom, flashlight in hand. The forest was still, but every now and then, he'd hear a twig snap or leaves rustle just beyond the edge of the light. He couldn't shake the feeling of eyes watching him from the shadows. Minutes passed, and the other three sat waiting in the tent, their chatter falling silent as the seconds dragged on. Then finally they heard footsteps. They looked up, expecting Connor, but as he came into the faint glow of the tent's flashlight, they noticed something was off. His face was pale and blank, his posture strangely stiff. He didn't say a word, just stood there staring at them. Connor? Jake whispered, his voice quivering. Without a word, Connor turned and vanished into the woods, his steps unnaturally quiet, his movements almost mechanical. They stared after him, hearts pounding, until a voice from behind broke the silence. Guys? It was Connor standing at the edge of the campsite with a confused look on his face. Where were you? I kept calling, but no one answered. Tyler's face went pale. If you're there, then who? What was that? The friends fell silent, the realization creeping over them like a cold shadow. Something else was out there, something pretending to be Connor. Their laughter and bravado had vanished, replaced by the stark, suffocating grip of fear. The rest of the night passed in restless silence, each of them jumping at the slightest sound. They huddled close, listening to the forest that seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. The whispers began, a soft, faint murmuring that seemed to come from every direction, just at the edge of hearing. They couldn't make out any words, but the sounds were low, raspy, filled with malice. When dawn broke, they searched the area for any sign of the creature, but the ground was strangely undisturbed, save for claw marks scratched into the trunks of nearby trees. They gathered their gear, determined to stick together, but as the sun rose higher, they found themselves caught in a maze of twisted paths, all looking the same. I swear, this was the way back to the car, Jake muttered, scanning the trees. The more they searched, the more it felt like the forest itself was shifting around them, trapping them. That night, they didn't bother with a fire, too afraid of drawing attention to themselves. The darkness was thick and absolute, pressing down on them like a heavy blanket. And then, the voices returned. At first, they thought it was one of them whispering, but soon the voices grew louder, circling around them, imitating each friend's voice. It was as if the forest had come alive with taunts, voices calling them in mocking tones. Over here, Jake. Mason, come here. I found a way out. The voices were distorted, mocking, and every time one of them tried to speak, the voice would mimic them in a grotesque, echoing parody. By midnight, they were all on edge, frayed nerves barely holding. Then Mason froze, his flashlight catching a figure just a few yards ahead, standing in the darkness. It was Tyler. Except, no. Tyler was right beside him. The figure smiled, but the smile stretched too wide, the teeth too sharp, and the eyes hollow. It lunged, a grotesque mimic of Tyler, its limbs moving in jerky, unnatural motions. Mason screamed, and the creature screeched in response, a guttural, inhuman sound that echoed through the trees. The four friends broke into a run, tearing through the underbrush, their breaths ragged, their hearts pounding. They could hear it behind them, chasing, sometimes close enough that they could feel its hot, fetid breath on their necks. The forest seemed endless. Every tree, every path blurred together in a dark, twisting landscape of terror. Then, just as the sun began to rise, they saw it. Their truck, parked just where they'd left it, gleaming in the morning light like a beacon. They didn't look back as they climbed inside, slamming the doors and speeding away, leaving the forest and whatever haunted it far behind. They never spoke of that night again, but each one of them carried it with them, the sight of their friend's face, twisted and distorted, the voices that called to them in mocking whispers, the forest that seemed alive with dark, shifting shadows. And every now and then, in the dead of night, they'd hear it. Those same whispers, soft and faint, echoing through the silence. The forest had let them go, but they knew deep down that a part of it had followed them home.